In the following tutorial, we will be going over how to set up GitHub Enterprise Cloud Copilot specific offering. Now, this offering of GitHub Enterprise Cloud is exclusively and specifically to only provision access to GitHub Copilot. You will not be able to generate repos, orgs, or related. Its main function is to provision users into the Enterprise Cloud and be able to grant them access to Copilot. Now, before we start, you should have received an email that looks something as the following, which gives you some details about your account. It lets you know that you're the owner of your enterprise, and it gives you the admin username. Now, this admin username is highly important. This username is not the same as your GitHub account or any other GitHub account you might have had. This admin email, we refer to it as the setup admin, which is the account that enables you to set up your GitHub Enterprise Cloud tenant. Then you're given a link to reset your password or to set that password. My advice here is do not click the link. You might want to just copy that link that's given and paste it within a browser where you're not logged into GitHub, just to prevent any issues from happening when you're trying to set up that new password. Now, with that being said, that's something I have already done. I'm going to be copying this username because I will be needing it later on. And I've already pasted that link within here. I'm going to go ahead and set up this password. Now, once done, I'm going to go ahead and click on Set Password. Now, once the password is set, you're going to get a successful message that your new password has been set, and it's going to ask you to log in. So I'm going to go ahead and log in. Click on Sign In. Now, as soon as I'm signed in, I am taken into the Enterprise Overview. A couple of things I want you to notice, it's that your options are pretty limited here. Under the overview, you can see the entirety of your enterprise. People, you're going to be able to see all the users that you've added. So far, we only have the enterprise admin. You're also going to be able to see the Copilot consume licenses. Then you're going to be able to go into identity priority settings that we're going to be covering in a minute. And then the policies, which pretty much just allow you to set up the configuration for Copilot, which we're going to be looking later on. Billing and licensing, where you're going to be able to set up your billing. And then other settings from within, such as the name of your enterprise and others that you can later on review. Now, as we start, I'm going to go ahead and click on Identity Provider. From within Identity Provider, I'm given two options: OIDC, single sign-on, or SAML single sign-on. Now, since I'm going to be using SAML for my single sign-on, I'm going to click on Add SAML Configuration. And immediately it's asking me for a couple of values here. Now, I'm going to head over to Azure, where I'm going to start setting up the application so I can get those values. So within my Azure portal, I am a global administrator. It's important that you are the global administrator so you're able to set this up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to head over into Enterprise Applications. And from within Enterprise Applications, I'm going to click on New Application. And on the search from within the Microsoft Entra gallery, I'm going to search for GitHub. Now from here, you're going to see a significant number of apps that will be displayed. Now the app that we'll be selecting to set this up is GitHub Enterprise Managed Users. If you were to choose, for example, setting up OIDC, the app that you would be selecting would be this one. However, since I am doing the SAML setup, I'm going to be selecting this one. Now that I've clicked on the application, I am being requested to input the name. Now the name is really not important. However, for ease of identification, I'm going to name my application the same name as my enterprise. So for this, I'm going to go back into GitHub. Now the name of your enterprise, it's usually the name that's displayed right here. However, I prefer to use the name of my enterprise that's within the URL, which is usually followed after github.com/enterprises/ the name of the enterprise. And the reason I prefer to use this one is because I want to make sure that I'm hitting the right endpoint. So I'm going to select this option and copy it. Now I'm going to go back into Azure. And from here, I'm going to add a hyphens and then paste the name of my enterprise. Now, as I said, this is really not important for me. It's just so that I'm able to identify it easier. I'm going to go ahead and click on Create. Now that it's created, I'm going to go ahead and click on Set Up Single Sign-On. I'm going to click on SAML. And from within SAML, even before I start setting anything up, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to head over to users and groups. Now, I suggest you do this step first because at a certain point in time within the application, we're going to be requested to authenticate from GitHub into Azure. If your user is not added, when you try to authenticate, you will most probably fail the authentication and we'll get something across the lines of 403 unauthorized. So in order to prevent that, I'm going to go ahead and click on Add User Groups and Add My User. So under Users and Groups, I'm going to select My User. Click Select. And then as the role of my user, I'm going to select Enterprise Owner. Now, within this setup, you're going to have different roles. You're going to have a billing manager, enterprise owner, restricted user, or user. By default, your users who are just getting Copilot access are going to be users. Since I am the enterprise owner, that means the person who's going to be managing my enterprise, I'm going to go ahead and grant myself the role of enterprise owner and click Select. Once done, I'm going to go ahead and click Assign. Once assigned, I'm going to be able to see my user added under Users and Groups. And at this point, I can click on Single Sign-On to proceed with my setup. Then I'm going to go ahead and select SAML. And from SAML, we are ready to proceed with the basic SAML configuration. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Edit. Now, within the basic SAML configuration, I'm requested to input a couple of values such as identifier, reply URL, and single sign-on URL. While the system does give you some examples, I do suggest do not use these patterns. What you want to use are the ones directly provided by the Microsoft documentation, which provides us an example on how the identifier should look like, how the reply URL should look like, and how the single sign-on URL should look like. So I'm going to go ahead and copy the first one, and I'm going to head back into Azure. I'm going to click on Add Identifier and paste this value right here. Now, after the enterprise, is asking for my entity. In this case, the entity is the name of your enterprise, which in my case is this one. As a refresher, you can obtain the name of your enterprise by going back into GitHub. Usually the name of the enterprise is the name within here, but I suggest you use the name from the URL, which is this one right here. This is for my case. Whatever your enterprise name is will appear after enterprises / the name of your enterprise. With that being said, I'm going to copy this value and head back into Azure. And then I'm going to go ahead and paste the name of my enterprise right here. Now that I've gotten the identifier, I'm going to start by adding now the reply URL. I'm going to go back into the Microsoft documentation, copy the reply URL, go back into Azure, paste it right here. And I'm going to replace the entity with the name of my enterprise. And I'll do the same now for the sign-on URL, heading back into the Microsoft Docs, copying the URL, and then back into Azure, and then pasting the sign-on URL right there. And I'm going to copy the name of my enterprise and then paste it where it says entity. Now that I've done that, make sure that you don't have any spaces or added slashes at the beginning or at the end. Just make sure that those endpoints look correctly. And then click on Save. Now, you're going to get a successful message that you have successfully saved your single sign-on configuration. We can close this out and then close this setup. Now, you will be asked if you want to test your application. I suggest you click on no, I'll test later, because if we test it right now, it will not work. The reason it will not work is because we're still missing to set it up on the GitHub side of things. Therefore, the endpoints are yet not valid. So go ahead and click no, I'll test later. Now, this part of the setup, we are ready to start setting up SAML in GitHub. For this, you'll need a couple of things. You'll need the basic64 certificate, the login URL, and the Microsoft Entra identifier. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by copying the login URL, going back into GitHub, and pasting it where it says sign on URL. Now I'm going to go back into Azure or Microsoft Entra ID and copy the Microsoft Entra identifier. And then I'm going to head back into GitHub and paste it under the issuer. And finally, for the public certificate, I'm going to go ahead and download my base64 certificate. Now, once downloaded, I'm going to go ahead and open it up. And what I'm going to do is that I will be opening it up in Visual Studio Code, which is what I use in this case. Let's call it my notepad for now. But you can really use anything that you prefer. And I'm going to select it, copy it, and then I'm going to head back into GitHub and paste it right here. Now, in this part, I'd like to expand this just to make sure I don't have any spaces at the beginning or at the end. In this case, I do have some spacing at the end, so I'm going to go ahead and delete that. And now that I verified that everything looks good, I'm going to go ahead and click on Test SAML Configuration. As soon as I am taken to test my authentication against my user account. I'll go ahead and click my user account, and it has successfully validated my settings. It states your SAML provider settings have been validated. Remember to save your changes. Perfect. So everything looks great so far. Now, I'll make a quick pause here because I've sometimes seen that the public certificate, when using the base64 certificate, for some reason it doesn't like it. It really depends on your tenant in Azure. So if that happens, I suggest you click on Edit. And what you want to do is, under Certificate, on the options, you want to download the PAM certificate, which is going to work exactly the same. This is only in the case that you're getting errors with the base64 certificate. Then again, you shouldn't, but there are some Microsoft Azure tenants where I've seen this, so I'm just raising it up in case this is happening to you. Now, with that being said, I'm going to go back into GitHub. Since I've already tested my configuration, everything looks good, I'm going to go ahead and click on Save SAML Settings. Once done, I'm giving some recovery codes that I will be needing to authenticate against my setup admin account. I suggest you copy or download these codes in a secure location because you will be needing them to access the setup admin in case you ever need to access that user. Once done, you'll notice that Enable SAML becomes enabled. So now I'm going to go ahead and click on Enable SAML Authentication. As soon as I do, you can now see that my SAML configuration has successfully been enabled. Now let's go ahead and configure SCIM for user provisioning. Before you do, you will need a token. In order to generate that token, I'm going to go ahead and click on the top right corner under my user profile, scroll down to Settings. From Settings, I'm going to scroll over to the left-hand side all the way to Developer Settings. From Developer Settings, I'm going to generate a new personal access token, and I'm going to select Token Classic. From here, I'm going to generate a new token and make sure it says Classic. And I'm going to call this Copilot SCIM Provisioning, or just Copilot SCIM. The name or the note really doesn't matter. It's just for me to identify it, but you can name it whatever you want. And then the expiration date, I will leave the default expiration as I'm just doing this video for demonstration purposes. Nevertheless, you want to make sure the expiration date is extended enough to at least a year, for example, or whatever your company requirements are. Fact is, if this token expires, Microsoft Entra ID will not be able to continue provisioning your users because that communication between Microsoft Entra ID and GitHub will not be valid as the token will not be valid. So with that being said, just keep that in mind so that you're able to make sure that you select the correct expiration date for your needs. Now, I'm going to leave the default and I'm going to scroll all the way down to where it says Admin Enterprise. And from here, I'm going to select that option. I'm going to scroll all the way down where I can now generate this token. And I'm going to click on Generate Token. I'm going to go ahead and copy that token, and I'm going to paste it on the location where I might access it later. I'm going to go back into GitHub and then click on Continue Setup. Now you'll also see on the message from your enterprise overview that you still need to configure SCIM for provisioning. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go back into Microsoft Entra ID, and I'll click on provisioning. From here, I'm going to click on Get Started. I'm going to change from the provisioning mode to automatic. And now it's asking for a tenant URL. That tenant URL can be found within the Microsoft documentation, which I'm going to be sharing the links within this video description, where the value you're going to need is exactly this value. I'm going to copy this value and head back into Microsoft Entra ID and paste the tenant URL right here. Now, we do need to change this with the name of our enterprise. I'm going to head back into GitHub, copy the name of my enterprise from the URL, head back into Microsoft Entra ID, and copy that URL right here. And finally, it's asking for the secret token. And that secret token is the token that we created on the step before. So I'm going to go ahead and open Visual Studio Code, copy my token, make sure there's no other spaces, and then go back into Microsoft Entra ID and paste it right here. Once done, I'm going to go ahead and click on Test Connection. Once I click on Test Connection, you can see that I'm getting a positive message that the connection has passed. So now I'm going to click on Save. Once saved, you'll get a successful message stating updating user provisioning settings. That looks great. And now I'm going to click on back on the GitHub Enterprise Managed User overview to start provisioning. Perfect. Once provisioning has started, provisioning is done on a 40-minute cron job. The only way to speed this up or accelerate it is if that you clicked on Provision on Demand, and Provision on Demand will allow you to automatically provision users a little bit faster. Where pretty much you are able to just push those users immediately. Now, I will go ahead and add a group before I leave Microsoft Entra ID so we can finish setting up GitHub. So I'm going to go back into my enterprise applications. I'm going to search for my application. And within my application, I'm going to assign users and groups. And I'm going to look for a group, my test group, which is this one right here. Click Select. From their role, I'm going to have them as normal users. That's fine. And then Assign. Once done, pretty much already have my group defined. My group has a total of 3 members. And what I'm going to do here now is I'm going to go back into my application under provisioning settings. And from the provisioning settings, I can already see a provision my user. This is the user that we set up at the beginning. So if I were to go back into GitHub and I go under people, I can already see my user was provisioned. That is great. But I also want to provision that group. And what I'm going to do as well for the purposes of this training video, I'm going to go ahead and go back into Microsoft Entra ID, click on Provision on Demand, my Microsoft Entra ID Jack Test Group. I'm going to click on View Members Only, and I'm going to select Alec and Logan. I'm not selecting myself because I already provisioned my user. And then I'll go ahead and click Provision. So what this does is pretty much skips that 40-minute cron job so that I can just provision my users immediately without having to really wait those 40 minutes to go by. And now I see that everything was done successfully. So at this point, there's really nothing for me to do in Microsoft Entra ID. We've completed that setup. And now I can focus on GitHub. I'm going to go back into GitHub. I'm going to do a quick refresh here. And now you can see all of my users being added. Great. So at this point, we have set up SAML, and we have set up SCIM for user provisioning. Now, in order to start setting up Copilot, there's a couple of things that need to get done first. For starters, you have maybe not yet integrated your Azure subscription. In order to do this, you want to go into billing and licensing. From billing and licensing, you want to go into payment information. And from payment information, you'll see add Azure subscription. So go ahead and click on this. And I'm going to log in with the account that contains my Azure subscription. Once done, I am now given the option to attach my Visual Studio Enterprise subscription to my GitHub tenant. So I'll select the Visual Studio subscription. I'll click Accept to Connect, and then click Connect. Once done, I have successfully added my Azure subscription to my tenant. Now, it's time for me to go ahead and let's start enabling Copilot. Now, if we head over to licensing, you'll notice that you'll still need to enable Copilot. So you could go ahead and click Go to Policies from here, or you can just simply go to Policies on this side. And we're going to start setting up Copilot by clicking on Allow. Under the Copilot Business settings, click on Save. Once done, you're going to get a significant amount of options that you can choose from. The options you select highly depend on you. For example, in my case, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to opt in into the preview message, into the previews. I am going to suggest matching public code being blocked. That's great. I'm going to enable Copilot in the IDE. I'm going to go ahead and give Copilot access to Bing. And then I'm going to enable the other LLMs as well. Once done, I'm going to go ahead and click on Save. At this point, I've completely enabled Copilot from a settings perspective. Now what we're going to be doing is creating our team. In order to add users to Copilot, you do need to have them added to a team first. So I'm going to go on within my Peoples tab. And here I'm going to go under Enterprise Teams. And I'm going to create a new Enterprise team. I'm going to call this team Copilot Access. Then again, you can really name this team whatever you want. It's completely up to you. For me, it's just easier to name it something that I find it easy to identify. And then you have the option to map it to an identity provider group. Now, this is completely something that's up to you. The benefit of doing this is that this enables me to look into the group that I have provisioned on Microsoft Entra ID. And by doing so, pretty much any user that I add to that group will automatically be added to my Copilot Access team. So from an access and provisioning perspective, you can really automate granting access to Copilot without having to even access GitHub by simply creating your team and mapping it to a group. That way, you just add the user to the group in Azure or Microsoft Entra ID, and it will automatically provision your user access to Copilot because the team will have access to Copilot. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and click on Create Team. Now you can see that my team has two users, Alec and Logan, which are the two users that I've selected from when I provisioned my team on demand. Now that I have a team set up, I can go back, and I can have multiple teams, by the way. This is just the team that I've created. Now that I've done that, I'm going to go back and go under Billing and Licensing. Under Billing and Licensing, I'm going to click on Licensing. And within my Copilot Business settings, I can click on Manage Seats. And from here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on Start Adding Teams. Keep in mind that you can only add users to Copilot via teams, not as individual users. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Start Adding Teams. I see my team here. I'm going to click on Add Teams. And I can see that my total consumed seats now has raised to 2. And my estimated monthly cost is going to be $38. Great. And you're going to see here that says pending assignment. Now this is expected. Your GitHub Enterprise Cloud tenant has a fail-safe system that in case you provision a team by mistake, so that you're not billed, you get about 30 minutes and where you can remove it and assign your teams in case you assign the team that maybe didn't want it to, and that prevents you from getting billed. Now, after 30 minutes, your users will get a notification that they have been added to Copilot, and they're going to be able to log in into their IDE to obtain access to Copilot. Now, their login information, in case you're wondering, it's not really their corporate email. Their login information will be their usernames. In this case, for me, jackgcafferty_AIEMU. This will be the username that I will be using to log in into Copilot. Now, they do get an email with that information, letting them know the next steps they might follow in order to have access to GitHub Copilot. Now that we set all of this up, in case you ever wanted to change any policy for Copilot, you can always go back to policies under Copilot for Business, and you can change those policies as needed. Now, with that being said, keep in mind we have already set up SAML for user authentication and SCIM for user provisioning. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to log out from my setup admin, and I'm going to log in with my account that was provisioned. Now, pretty important, I want you to notice that before I added the underscore, it says sign in. But the moment I do underscore, or I add the underscore, it immediately says sign in with your identity provider. This is how we're able to identify that this account is not part, for example, of any regular GitHub account. It's a pretty specific account for your tenant. So when I click on sign in with your identity provider, it's taking me to authenticate against my Microsoft Entra ID tenant. So when I click continue, it goes through that flow where I select my user. Since I had already authenticated before, it goes ahead and grants me access. And from here, if I click on the top right corner under my user icon and I go under my enterprises, I can see my enterprise, I can see my users. I can go ahead and set up my policies for Copilot. And when it comes to identity provider settings, I want you to notice that I'm not able to disable SAML. This is because only the setup admin has that capability. However, as an enterprise owner, I can still edit the SAML configuration, such as the public certificate, in case this became expired. Now, at this point, we have successfully set up your GitHub Enterprise Cloud Copilot specific tenant. We have set up SAML and SCIM for user provisioning. We've created a team and we granted that team access to Copilot. Now, your users will still get that email where it will give them the details on how to log in to use Copilot. As well, if you're using Visual Studio Code as I am, all you have to do is under your user icon in Visual Studio Code, you're going to be able to sign in like I've already done. And from here, once done, you will be asked to download some extensions, which I've already done. In this case, those extensions are going to be GitHub Copilot, and then it also installs GitHub Copilot Chat, which is this guy right here, where I am ready to start using Copilot. And that's our setup completed.